told through the stories of today's leaders in finance, tech, real estate, culture, and sustainability. This is Planet Gold, with your host, Enzo Di Taranto.
Welcome to this new edition of Planet Gold, my eco-podcast to re-engineer the global climate agenda at the Horizon 2030. In this new episode, I speak with Cristina Dolan, a Massachusetts Institute of Technology graduate in computer sciences, and also a former chair of the MIT Enterprise Forum. Cristina has also been named as women as top 100 women in finance in the United States. Cristina Dolan is a bestseller author with her book on ESG and circular economy and how to use the data to rethink the ESG policies and the methodologies. It was a very interesting conversation during which we touched multiple issues related to to re-engineering the global climate agenda and accelerate the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Cristina is half American and half Spanish, so we also discuss the different approaches to ESG in Europe and the United States, and also how the new trends towards rewarding sustainability and responsible brands and products are evolving in the consumers' behaviors and psychology, both in Europe and in the United States of America. We also discussed about how technology and sustainability are influencing the booming health and longevity industries worldwide.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And so, thank you for inviting me to be part of this, because obviously having co-authored a book in this space, written articles, it's a very important space. And I think that there's a little bit of confusion in terms of what it actually means. I think there's just one focus of decarbonization, which I think people talk about, but there's a lot of different facets, which hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about. So I would describe myself as somebody who was trained or educated as an engineer, but has been sort of at the crossroads of very disruptive technologies, all throughout my career, from sort of the internet, e-commerce. I was co-founder of a company we took public in the internet connectivity space. I was CEO of an MIT spinoff in the AI or computational linguistics space in the sort of prehistoric days. It was like pre-2017 days. Then transitioned into institutional financial data, which is one of the reasons why, in terms of writing that book, it was kind of interesting to write a book on ESG and circular economy data. And from there, I got involved, obviously, finance and blockchain. And through my volunteer efforts at MIT, we were doing a lot of fun events in New York around blockchain very early on. And that's how I got involved in blockchain and Bitcoin in parallel to institutional financial trading. And from there, I transitioned into being some more entrepreneurial into the cybersecurity space, because obviously when you develop all these new technologies, create cyber risks, which of course are, as I said in my article in the World Economic Forum blog, cyber is the most immediate financial and material risk that organizations face. And it also does impact climate and a variety of other UN sustainability goals. And so from there, I pursued, cyber risk and have worked in the cyber risk assessment, cyber insurance space, co-founded a company in the insurance space, and then went on to work in the cyber risk as well as the, network detection response and incident response, which, as you know, is something that's growing pretty substantially. In addition to that, in Spain, I co-founded a company called Additum that's focused on value-based medicine, which obviously is important, is to develop the governance and APIs to be able to develop greater forms of healthcare. And of course, obviously healthcare delivery is one of the UN sustainability goals as well. But with the declining number of people that are willing to work in that space, meeting the objective for everyone to have better healthcare is a little bit difficult unless you start relying on data artificial intelligence, technology. And, of course, there are a lot of examples of how technology is being used in the medical field. So that sort of in summary, of course, I mentioned that I'm on a couple of public boards, and I do a lot of public speaking, but I would basically describe myself as someone who's always been at the crossroads of these incredibly disruptive technologies and developing new, interesting ways of solving interesting problems with these technologies for everyone. So, but thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we will certainly develop our conversation at the intersection between technology and sustainability. But before doing that, and before asking what is your definition of ESG, I would like to know when and how your passion for sustainability emerged in your life.
So it's interesting. Obviously we were all impacted by the pandemic, and we've all heard about decarbonization, right? And those are little sort of points of pain. You sort of learn a little bit about it. But what was interesting was when the publisher sort of reached out and said, would you be interested in writing a book on ESG? Because you had worked sort of as a product manager in the data space for institutional financial trading. I thought, wow, this will be easy. I'll get this done really quickly. And I think the thing that was really difficult is the fact that sustainability has so many different definitions. And then you start digging down in terms of the different frameworks and philosophies and data sets and approaches. And, for example, SASB, which is used by public companies, that is the impact of the world on a company. Will the company survive, right? And we've all been impacted during the pandemic when supply chains weren't available. I mean, silly things like, toilet paper became a joke, but there's also the issue of whether or not you can get parts for your car, for example. So there were a lot of different variables that impacted people in that capacity. So whether a company survive, it is important. And it's not just the employees, it's not just the investors. It's the fact that if an organization has a concentration of people in a small town that are working there, or if one of their partners has a concentration of people in a small town, and those people, for some reason, lose their jobs because the company imploded or their partners, that means that they don't have a tax base to pay for the education. They don't have a tax base to, pay for the, getting their haircut. So all the small business in that town. So there is kind of a sort of a domino effect with respect to whether organizations survive or not. And we also see this with cybersecurity and third-party risk and as another example, right? But then you look at this from a GRI perspective as another, let's say another framework that's used to describe sustainability risk. And that is more about the organization's impact on the world. So I said SASB was the world's risk impact on the company, whether the company will survive, right? The risks they're facing. And GRI is the company's impact on, whether the world will survive, right? And the UN sustainability goals are, different in that it's more about, humanity and the world will survive. And so it's things like poverty and hunger. And even though they're all intertwined, understanding all these various facets was kind of eye-opening to me, because when I first said that I would write the book, I thought, this is going to be pretty easy, until I realized that, at every level you have so many different definitions from, different ways of these different approaches on the frameworks, the different data sets. There's some organizations that will take one form of these frameworks and they'll tweak it a little bit just to sort of adhere to some values that they have in their organization. Or, for example, they'll get their data from a different source. So they'll get satellite data to understand where water tables are moving versus going to FEMA organization, was a public US government organization that publishes water tables. And of course, that might be 3 years old. So you're going to get very different viewpoints. So having worked in institutional financial trading data, it was just fascinating to me how complex this space is and how many different views they are on the variety of these different risks, because ESG is a risk metric. It's and it just has a variety of different lenses by which it's looked at. So in terms of when I got involved, because I think it's easy to say, oh, I care about the climate, but really understanding all of those variables and how they're interconnected requires a little bit of discipline to really just dig in. It's not something you can think about at the surface and say, oh, okay, well, now I have an electric car, so I'm really very conscious. There's a lot of different facets. You look at SASB, as I mentioned before, which is one of the frameworks that's used for evaluating the whether or not a company is going to survive. I mean, they have a materiality map. So, for example, I would say, the clothing business, creates a number of different problems, from, the materials that put waste into the water, right? And then, the disposable approach that many low-end clothing manufacturers have taken, in that clothes become somewhat disposable, so they don't get recycled and thrown away. So I think when you become aware of things at that level, then you can come up with very interesting solutions at a local level to try to figure out how to resolve them. So I would say I was aware of sustainability, but it wasn't until I wrote the book and tried to come up with some mechanism by which to organize all of these different components, which are also different, to basically understand how people defined their approach, what their risks are in their organization. And I would basically say that unless an organization has good governance, they probably won't have the right KPIs. They won't be able to measure them, enforce them. So there's a lot of different aspects to ESG and sustainability. And I think that having gone through the discipline of writing that book, I became very aware of all those components, which makes it a lot easier to be able to say that without a local initiative, feet on the ground, it's very difficult to implement things that really matter, even if they're small things.
Absolutely. No, that's interesting, because last year we organized a sustainable fashion activation in Miami during the Formula One Grand Prix week. And I promoted a company, an Israeli company called Sonovia, that has created a technology that allows to produce denim textile, the one for the jeans, with 90% less water.
Wow.
Because to brighten the textile and to make it denim, you need to wash it with an enormous quantity of water. And which is very water consuming, but also polluting, because they are using chemicals to do that. So returning to your point, valuable point of having local and practical solutions, that particular technology came to my mind. But Cristina, because you are half European, half Spanish, and half American, and you have both cultures inside your life story, and you understand both economies, which are quite different, as you well know. So how would you share with us your views about ESG in Europe and in the United States? How ESG has been perceived so far, until we are now disrupting it. So we want that everybody will look at ESG after this conversation from a different perspective. But so far, how you see Europeans and Americans approaching ESG from a corporate perspective?
So it's interesting. Once again, I guess it all depends upon the different layers, right? So I think that Europe, hands down, is the leader in regulation, right? So they do a really good job of regulating and creating these really well thought out regulations, which I think, if you look at sort of GDPR and data, obviously then gets adopted all over the world. But sort of at a general level, I would say that Americans are bigger at consuming. They're just bigger consumers. And I don't necessarily see as much consumption. It's not as much of a consumption culture as I would say the Americans are. And I think that, maybe because, their economies are such that, they're at the personal level, I see a lot more frugality in terms of reusing and, just reusing items. So for example, in Spain, you have a water crisis. So by that just small, not that small, but just that one local issue does make people a lot more conscious about, their water usage, and people pay, for their water usage. Whereas in the United States, not every geography is paying for their water usage. And so, I do think that it kind of all depends on what it is that you're looking at. I think in the United States, because of the fact that, you have all these global public markets, and you have a great focus on the sustainability of organizations and from a regulatory perspective, how those organizations are behaving. Now you have all these regulatory requirements for publicly held companies around cybersecurity. I think that you do have a sustainability focus within the context of business objectives. But I think that from a frugality and, from a consumer perspective, I think that Europe by default has always been a lot more, what I'd say, conservative with respect
Conservative.
to,
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So in this context, how obviously the United States is more developed in R&D as far as technological development is concerned, while you say European Union is much more structured and stricter in terms of regulations. But from a pure technological standpoint, how you see the new developments in AI, machine learning, the blockchain, I mean, these new tech trends, how we can use them intelligently and strategically to accelerate the implementation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals at the horizon 2030.
So it's interesting. So my opinion on this is going to be probably a little different than most people because I'm an engineer and I've spent my entire career focused on, computing and, technological advances. So, but when I look at this whole list of UN sustainability goals, for example, most of them technology can have an impact on improving a good number of them. And I'm fortunate enough to live in New York. I went to school at MIT, so I have a lot of friends in California. They're very involved in the innovations like around artificial intelligence and a lot of the interesting technologies that are out there that are, making it possible, for example, for people to do, I would say, like online education or they're improving people's lives in some way or another. And so I think in the United States, we're very fortunate in that you have the capital, the intellectual capabilities of being able to create these innovative solutions. But it's interesting because I look at Europe, right, and I said they're always leaders in the regulatory side, and I think that PSD2 that came out of GDPR, which is sort of this open banking standard. I mean, they were the first. Europe was the first to come up with that idea, and the ability to be able to use, just being able to use data for a variety of different purposes. So think about it, 90 some odd % of most economies are small and medium businesses, and their ability to get, on-demand loans is critical for the growth of those companies, and that drives the employment, right? And so this idea of having the ability to use data from your bank account that you've permissioned in order to be able to figure out, do you have the cash flow to be able to take out a loan, for example, for your business? And so that whole concept of using that data on your behalf I think it was a brilliant idea, but you look at how the UK implemented, open banking and all the innovations that came out because their approach was a little different. They ended up working with a number of financial institutions that then created these sort of incubators, and then you all of a sudden had all these great ideas that started to incubate. The US was completely different. It was like the wild, wild west. And it was like all these companies that went out and started just using this data and being able to create loans for education. And instead of being able to having to rely on these data sets from some of the larger, financial rating companies, right? And so, for example, being able to, somebody studying to be a doctor, they probably don't have great there's not a lot of financial data that would make it compelling to lend them money, but then they graduate from medical school and all of a sudden they're getting a good salary. The data points aren't indicative of whether or not those people are capable of paying back. But if you start using other data sets, then all of a sudden it becomes more interesting to say, okay, these people are young, they just graduate, there's no financial data on them, but they would be, they would make for, good customers for these lending products. So I think that in the United States, we benefit from the fact that, there's been a tremendous amount of innovation. And as I told you, I was CEO of an MIT spin out that was in the AI space. And I call it the prehistoric because it was before this sort of generative model of AI. but I look at sort of what are the possibilities of what you can do with these, AI models, the use of data. I'm very passionate about the use of AI for healthcare because of the fact that, right now there aren't enough people want to be doctors or nurses or want to work in the healthcare space. So if you're not able to do things like, detection, for example, for cancer, for example, utilizing some level of technologies, you start thinking about parts of the world where you have one oncologist for thousands of people. I mean, the chances that any, people who really need that oncologist, they're not going to be able to access them because you can't stretch one person out, to meet the needs of 3,000. And so unless you sort of imprison smart people and then make them become doctors and enslave them to provide those services, I mean, it's a difficult problem, right? So those gaps are going to require the use of technology and AI. And so, I know kind of sort of off the topic here, but when I hear very generic statements about, well, let's hold back on our AI, I think to myself, okay, I think responsible AI is important, but AI comes in so many different flavors, and not all AI is consuming, data from like the New York Times or GDPR data off of some website that shouldn't have exposed it. There are a lot of ways of using artificial intelligence for the greater good, and if we if we set these regulatory mandates and say, hold back, don't do anything, you're limiting the amount of innovation that can be done to actually help, solve some of these global problems, because innovation is expensive, and you need to eliminate the regulatory barriers to get people motivated to participate in providing a solution to some of these great problems. So I think that I benefit from living in the United States the majority of the time. And I think it's wonderful that we have so many innovators and we have such great universities where there's a cross-pollination of ideas. I don't necessarily think that all these small countries that have languages that are sort of limited to the geographies of their environments have that benefit. So for example, if you talk to people that have been doing sort of research in this generative AI space using the open models, which keep in mind, there's a lot of AI that's not using open data and open models, but let's just talk about that in a minute. What's interesting is that because most of the content is generated in North America, when you talk about generative text, outside the United States, North American English, most of the content that's available is like, for example, religious has to do with religion. And so the generated language that comes from these systems outside of the United States doesn't necessarily have that strong a body of text to consume and train. And so the outputs are somewhat stymied by the fact that you don't have that much participation. So kind of going back, I think it's a mistake to pull back on these technologies, because it will limit the ability for certain countries to be able to innovate and keep up, and to be able to provide very interesting solutions that are required to solve a lot of very important problems.
This problem, absolutely. You mentioned the application of technology to the health sector, and then you say I'm going a little bit out, of context. But I want to say that in my vision of sustainability, the application of technology to health in general terms goes directly and rapidly in the direction of affirming more and more sustainability, because from a spiritual perspective, what I think is happening and has been happening so far is that our disconnect from our own body, right, is the primary cause of the destruction of the planet. You see, because this lack of consciousness of the fact that we are drinking from plastic bottles, which is, part of the pop culture nowadays. I mean, nobody, is impressed or surprised that we are drinking water from a plastic bottle, and together with the water, we are drinking and ingesting microplastics that, make our cells plastic in some way. And nobody's surprised that, the oceans are filled by plastics and toxics, and then this enters into the food chain, and then we eat those plastified fishes, and this vicious circle is become usual and normal, you see. And so the fact that we are throwing plastics in the environment is due to this disconnect between ourselves and our bodies, and then ourselves and the environment. You see what I mean?
Agree.
So
yeah.
I think that there is a direct connection between sustainability, technology, and longevity that is not being reflected upon yet sufficiently, and requires a little bit more of maturation in our thinking and in our awareness. And so what you said is indeed not out of context, but very much at the core of what I think is one of the solution of this huge challenge that we are all tackling as humanity, which goes not necessarily only in the direction of technology and economy, but also in the direction of inner awareness and a new philosophy or a new vision of health, which is a more holistic, right? So what do you think about this vision that I have, that I've not been yet able to articulate properly, because it's complex, and as Einstein said, we need to simplify the complexity, right? So I'm still finding a way to communicate that simply, but your inputs would be certainly valuable to me.
So it's interesting that you were commenting on that. So when, having grown up between sort of Madrid and the United States, I mean, one of the things that is very noticeable, I mean, I think it's changing, but growing up in New York, I mean, it's like very common to see people walk down the street and they'll have like a soda or coffee, like, they will eat on the go in these consumable products. And, even, when I had my kids, I'd go to the park and everybody had all kinds of snacks that they would bring with them to the park. And being European, it's like the whole idea that you would constantly have snacks everywhere, that, walking down the street, you would never see somebody walking down the street with a drink in their hand, drinking a bottle. Like it was just like, if you went to a coffee shop and said, I want a coffee to go, they'd be like, in Europe, and they'd be like, that's so strange. And I remember at some point somebody said to me, I heard that in the United States, especially in New York, these women will be all dressed up in their suits and they'll have a coffee cup made out of paper to drink their coffee with like lipstick stains on it while they're running to work. It's like, why can't they have the coffee in their office? And I laugh because I was part of that culture, but I never really thought about it that way. And the number of disposable items, bag of potato chips. And so when I mean, I think that's changing, unfortunately, in Europe. You do see this snack culture. You always see people eating on the street as they're walking down the street. And so the reason why I bring that up is because obviously that affects your health. And I do think that when people don't take care of their health, it taxes the healthcare system for everyone, right? So so taking care of your health is something that you have to do yourself. Once again, it's like, this is the local view on that, and becoming aware of the fact that, when you don't take care of yourself, you're also putting greater demands on the overall system that is already limited, right? But then taking that a bit further, it's not even just the impact on the healthcare. It's the fact that family and people, like, you'll read these articles about people that are over a certain age, and if they're not spending time with other people, they get depressed and their longevity is much shorter, right? So I think there's something to be said about how people connect, how they communicate. And I know we all use devices and communicate very effectively, but that human connection is also an important part. And that's related to how people enjoy their meals together. And I would actually say that all this junk food is more expensive. It takes away from your overall health. Costs you money. And then it also takes away from the importance of spending time with and connecting with people. So even if it's a business meal where you're connecting and collaborating, that's an important contribution. And so once again, I feel like all of these different topics are somewhat interrelated. And that's why I always say that just looking at decarbonization as one sustainability objective is a little bit of a mistake.
Limited.
Yeah, it's very limited because all of these things are actually connected. And so I do laugh when I mean, now when I go to Europe, I do see people walking down the street eating something, which like you never saw that. Like you know, prior to the big Starbucks craze, which isn't that big in Europe, but you would never see people walking down the street having a cup of coffee. It was just like unheard of. And here in the United States, you just see it all the time. You get your app, you order at the store, and you don't even talk to a human. You just pick it up and just walk down the street with your coffee, right? And so it's just interesting from a cultural perspective. Small things like that add up. And so talking about, you know, the oceans and the number of plastic bottles floating around and the plastic island, which very few people are kind of aware of. What they don't recognize is that when you make these choices, you're affecting the healthcare system, you're affecting your connectivity with other humans, you're affecting, you know, you're contributing towards the pollution problem. And so, but, you know, these are culturally ingrained in society. And so, and I know that these reusable cups and bottles, et cetera, are sort of educating people on the fact that, you know, there is another option, but there is a cultural component that's built into how people, you know, grab these disposable items.
Absolutely. No, that's very interesting. And well, I don't want to go in this direction during our conversation because we want to capitalize upon your engineering perspectives, which are very, very valuable. But certainly this cultural and the lifestyle behavioral elements are in my view at the core of the solutions. Because, you know, we can have whatever technological advancement, but humans do not use those technologies in the right way, then, you know, it's more of the same, or even it's faster and more detrimental to the planet, because obviously technology is very, very powerful, and that the way humans use technology is the key and the change element that we have to trigger. Now, I must say that at COP28 in Dubai in December, because there was a significant youth representation, you know, from civil society. I was there with a huge global platform called POP. POP stands for Protect Our Planet. And we have the aim of mobilizing 2 billion young people around the world on, you know, to raise awareness and engagement around the climate agenda. So all these issues and all this awareness about the connection between humans and the planet, and that as I said, that connection goes through the bodies. So to me, is human identity, bodies, and planet. Everything is connected. So this is a little bit more evident in young people, because they think, you know, farther in terms of, you know, the world. And at COP28, I've felt that these issues were part of the agenda and of the discussion. However, because of the more senior and specialized audience at Davos during the World Economic Forum, I didn't see these critical elements as part of the agenda, as part of the discussion. So I would like to hear your views, because I know that you have been following Davos as well, on if you think that the elites of this world are still disconnected from this way of thinking, from this new philosophy of, as you said in your book, circular economy, which is not just economy, right? It's that holistic approach. Yeah. So if you see these issues as being part of the political, the global political agenda, or not yet, or not sufficiently there?
I didn't see it sufficiently there. And as a matter of fact, I was actually quite thrilled about the fact that you for the first time, we actually saw a focus on cybersecurity, which, once again, most immediate financial and material risk we face today. So I think that because of the fact that over 50% of the population is going to be voting, and there's this big issue on trust, I think that there were a lot of high-level discussions with respect to sort of what that means. But I think that, I have a little bit of a difference in opinion with some people on this. I think that if you want to get things done, you have to be local. You can't, have people pay all this money at some senior level to, participate in the Paris Agreement and just think everything's going to work out okay. You need to have action at the local level, and you need to have engagement. Part of the problem is that I think that there is a level of understanding outside of decarbonization. I don't think that people even understand sort of all of these various risks that they could do some small thing to actually be able to change. I mean, there's been a little bit of PR with respect to reusing your bottles and not using plastic bottles. We're all now carrying our own bags to the supermarket and no longer getting, the traditional free plastic bags that we all used to have. And so I think that there are some different ideas that are being imposed from a top-down perspective because of these awareness campaigns. But I think that there is a requirement for education in order for people to engage. Like, for example, I think it's kind of interesting how many people will buy these, what I call disposable clothes, and just throw them away and buy new ones. I mean, when you wash some of these shirts, they don't last, they don't hold up. And so people have gotten used to paying a lot for certain items of clothing and then just throwing them out, and they end up on a heap. And it's interesting because, I sort of grew up, as I said, between Europe and the United States, in which there was this incredible appreciation for the art of fashion and clothes and beautiful Hermes scarves and these incredibly beautiful leather pocketbooks that you would keep for some time. And this idea of moving towards everything is disposable is sort of a cultural thing that I'm hoping will shift back because, that affects our planet in very negative way, but most people aren't aware of it, right? Because it's like a behavior pattern. So I think that it's a great idea to be able to educate people so that they can make smarter choices. Like, I think buying something that is a little bit more expensive but will last many different, many seasons is probably a smarter way to go than buying something that's cheap that you will throw away at the end of the season and it just ends up being part of the problem. And so I do think education is a big part of it, because the requirement for action to take place is going to be at a local level. And if you don't educate the people, it's just not going to happen. All these great sweeping ideas are wonderful because, you need to start somewhere, but you need the action at a local level. And so engaging young people that care and are passionate and giving them mechanisms by which, or giving them information they need in order to play a bigger part, I think is really critical.
Yeah, it is. And my vision of the solutions to this challenge that we are tackling is, is to unify the elites and the masses, towards the same objectives. And right now there is a dichotomy between, the decision makers and the consumer. Well, I shouldn't say the consumers, but the citizens, if I can say in that way, right? So I think that our job as leaders in the different sectors that we are leading is to accelerate and enhance the dialogue between these two, top-down elements of the global society. And I think that one of the key is certainly education, as you said, not only education for young people, but also education for the parliamentarians and the politicians and the CEOs of big financial groups. And I can tell you, I speak with them all, and I can tell you that there is certainly a new and, a raising awareness about the need to, do something. Maybe it's not yet clear in their mind what to do, but certainly there is an expanded consciousness about the responsibility that they have at the decision-making level, from presidents and ministries down. And so education is also, in that perspective, is not just for young people, but I think that the key to accelerate this process is through the markets, because we like it or not, humans are moved by money at all levels, which is, a survival instinct. So if you are a CEO of a big company, your instinct is the survival of that company, and which goes through profit. Or if you are, a householder, your instinct is to have the monthly bills covered at the end of each cycle. So money is what really moves people. And if we manage to influence the consumers to buy more sustainable, organic, responsible products, then also the whole economic chain, the supply chain that you also mentioned, will move in that direction. You
Totally
see?
agree. Totally agree.
Yeah, and so I think that this is one of the solutions that I have in mind. But Cristina, this conversation is very interesting. I would continue speaking with you for hours, but to make the most for our audience, I always make a question to my guests, which is the magic wand question, as I call it. So imagine that you have no limitations, no financial, technological, humans, constraints, that you would have access to any resource you would need. What would be the only thing that you would do to move the global climate agenda to the next level?
I would probably say education for a variety of different reasons, only because education is so central to being able to provide better standard of living. And kind of to your point before, that if you educate people that are either investing and or buying particular products, I mean, the people running these companies can't get financing, they can't get people to work for them, they can't generate revenue unless they're doing the right thing. But if you don't educate people as to what the right thing is, they're not going to align themselves with their proper goals, so that they're rewarding the companies that are doing the right thing and not aligning to the ones that are not doing the right thing. And I think in the end, if that strategy works, organizations will be much more motivated to be able to do the right thing versus just sort of responding to the needs for capital growth or whatever that, or revenue growth. So I think that education is probably the most important. And then also because when you provide education, at multiple levels, I mean, I talked about the healthcare education. If you understand how to manage your health, and to your point, you're going to do a better job of managing how you create a healthy environment around you as well, right? And that puts less pressure on the healthcare systems. You're going to make choices that are much more important. And then from an education perspective, I think that we live in a world that's constantly changing. I mean, my entire career has been based on that. But if you don't have the ability to educate, then you can't be part of the economic value that's generated and the GDP. And if you can't, then you can't even make healthy choices, right? So, because you're just going to make the survival choice of whatever that might be just to get by. And that could involve, like you and I had once talked about, certain parts of the world where there's, living on $2 a day or whatever that amount is. And as a result of that, to cook their food, they're not using the most environmentally friendly mechanisms for cooking their food. They're just trying to survive, right? So I do think that education becomes the key that sort of unlocks people's ability to participate and generate economic value for themselves and the world. And then in that process, they can learn a little bit more about how they can have a positive impact on the planet and the world that they live in. So, so that would be my guess. But and of course, technology could deliver to places that have electricity, which is often a problem. But yeah, but I think finding ways to educate is probably the best choice.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree with that. And also the way how we use technology to accelerate the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, including education, free education for all, is certainly the focus of our research and our work moving forward. So,
Yeah.
Cristina, thank you so much for your time, your knowledge sharing, knowledge building, and your kindness and clarity in divulgating your decades of work in a few minutes. It's a very valuable knowledge. I encourage our audience to read your book on ESG and the circular economy, to look at your LinkedIn profile, and so stay in touch with Cristina Dolan on a new way of thinking and approaching the ESG and the circular economy at the Horizon 2030. Thank you again. I thank you also the Hadley Broadcasting Company for producing this Planet Gold episode. And as always, love the planet.
Well, thank you so
All
much for
right.
having me, both Enzo and Benedict. This was amazing. Thank you so much.